Hello and welcome to our study on the Bible book by book. Today we are talking about the book of Numbers. For many people, the book of Numbers is difficult at best because of the censuses that take place at the beginning and the end of the book. And for a lot of people, they get bogged down in reading that and forget about everything else that's in between. But the stuff that is in between those lists of numbers, that's where we want to focus, and it also is wonderful for explaining who we are. You see, the people of Israel that are represented in these stories are a typology. These stories are supposed to represent who Israel is as a people group and how they interact with God. But beyond that, they're meant to represent us, the whole people, the whole human race. Israel is a stand-in for what we are and who we are. So as you're reading this group of numbers, you want to think about the fact that this is me, this is my community, this is how we act. I saw it expressed in a cartoon once that I think is fantastic, where the pastor of a church is in a Bible study, and the people in the Bible study are all sitting around the table, and they're responding with criticism. Why do we have to study the book of Numbers? All it is a series of stories about people who fail and who are complaining, not noticing that the people who are in the Bible study are the ones likewise complaining. So the book of Numbers really does illustrate who we are as people groups. And while I don't have a ton of time to go through all of it, there is a great deal of overlap between Numbers and Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Numbers, in some ways, is a commentary on these books, and it is a furthering of the themes that are found in those books. Kind of, you see in the stories in Numbers where some of the themes that are presented in Genesis through Leviticus are expanded on and presented in story material. For instance, if you look at the book of Numbers, and especially after you get through those opening chapters where we have the census, start in right around chapter 9, where the people are getting ready to leave Sinai, where they've been camped. If you look at that closely, it reflects the same kind of storyline of Israel coming out of Egypt and entering Sinai. So in Exodus, the people come out of Egypt after seeing great miracles. They have the cloud of God's presence in front of them. They have they see the miracles that are worked. They know God is with them, and yet they complain about what? Moses' leadership, that they're going to die in the wilderness, that they don't have enough food, and they don't have enough water. Well, as the people are leaving Sinai and moving out into the wilderness, what are they doing? They are seeing God's presence in the cloud that descends around them. This cloud that protected them from Pharaoh and his armies is back, protecting them as they go out into the wilderness. And yet, they complain about not having enough food, about not having enough water, and about Moses' leadership. These are the themes that will mark God's people. The theme of God's forgiveness. We saw this in the golden calf story in Exodus 32, where God forgives the people despite the fact that they break covenant immediately after they sign the covenant. They ratify the covenant that is presented to them, and immediately they make the golden calf. God yet forgives them, thanks in part to the intercession of Moses, but God forgives the people. Here we have in Numbers, God gives a word to Moses to go into the land and not be afraid, and the people, right after they are coming out of the wilderness with all of this fanfare that we will follow God wherever we are led, immediately Moses leads them into conflict and they back away. Yes, God said to do it this way, but we are scared. And just like there were consequences of those actions in Exodus with the golden calf, so there are consequences in Numbers as the people go out against God's will to fight the enemy and are roundly defeated. So we have here this parallel of the people of God acting the same way that they always act, even after they are given the law of Leviticus, even after they have all of the statutes that God wanted to put in place, even after they have seen all of the miracles, they continue to act in the same ways. This is a story that reminds us that Christ-likeness is a slow grind. C.S. Lewis said something to the effect of, every day you might get up and you might not see much change. Day after day you get up and you don't see much change. But you reach a certain point in the road and you turn around and look back and you realize things have radically changed. That's how it is with God. Day after day you're going to get up and you are going to recognize very little, if any, change in your life. But at a certain point you're going to get up and you're going to go, oh, I'm more like God if you keep following the plan and the path. That is the story of Numbers. You see, they spend 40 years wandering the desert. One generation dies off and a new generation comes up. And while they don't really look too much different at the end, there's a significant enough difference that when that new generation is presented with the same information or very similar information as the old generation, they follow God into the promised land. You'll notice in Numbers, we see spies go out, they come back, the people get scared, and they run away. In Joshua, spies go out, the people have faith, and they take possession of the land. This is a theological statement much more than it is a historical statement. It's about wandering with God for 40 years changes us to a point where we can trust God a little bit more. So we do have all of these passages where the spies go out and they come back, and then the people respond and they go into the wilderness. But buried in all of that material is one phrase that I want to highlight, and it comes from Numbers chapter 6. We sometimes forget about this, that what goes on daily in the religion of Israel is this blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. This is the blessing of the priests. And it is vitally important for us to understand that for Israel, as they went through the wilderness, this was part of their growth. This was part of their development. They were hearing this phrase again and again. And again, that works on us, that grows through us. But no sooner do they get into the wilderness than we have Korah's rebellion, where people don't like the way Israel is being led. They don't like the way Moses is going about things, so they challenge his authority and his leadership. Moses has spoke to the people for over a year, giving them guidance, showing them miracles and signs, and yet they reject that leadership. And they go after the charismatic Korah. I think this speaks volumes to us, that very often we don't like the direction that God's taking us, and we reject the leader who shows wisdom and courage. We reject the leadership that points us down the path of faithfulness, and instead we favor the leader with charisma. We decide that the person who has the fire is better than the person who has the wisdom. But here again, God justifies Moses' leadership, causing Aaron's rod to blossom. In other words, bringing life out of a dead stick. We should read in that how God brings life to dead situations to prove true leadership. Over and against the charismatic movement of Korah, the people's uprising. Now, again, we want to make sure that we are defining, when we talk about roles and leadership and all that, we do have to be very, very careful, because it's very easy to see God's blessing, or to think we see God's blessing in charismatic leaders who get popular support, rather than in true wisdom and leadership where true life happens. So we want to be careful how much we read into stories like this. But immediately after that, Moses is even challenged by his brother and sister. And we see how both of them are cursed for their own hubris and their own desire to be leader over the people of Israel. And Moses is established above everyone else. And then right after that, we have these just great passages through Numbers right in this section. The second half, kind of maybe the last third of the book, we should say. Some great passages where we see Balaam trying to curse Israel, but because God is with Israel, the true prophet Balaam can only ever bless Israel. Balaam, who actually is a real legitimate prophet working for the king of Moab. Think about that for a minute. A legitimate person who speaks to God legitimately, working for Israel's enemy. That should make us think about how we classify and view people who differ from us on a lot of lines. Balaam was a true prophet who worked for Moab. But because he was a true prophet and spoke truly about God, he was warned not to speak anything but what God tells him. He is given signs from God. And he speaks for God even when it contradicts what the person paying him wants him to say. As we think about prophets, one of the things that we should always think about, because this comes up again and again in the Old Testament, one of the things we should always think about and always consider is, does the prophet speak against the power that he or she represents? Again and again in the Hebrew Bible, the powers at be hire prophets And the prophets who truly speak for God criticize those powers as much as they support. They criticize those areas where the power is differing from God. So as we listen to modern American prophets, ask yourself this question. Is this prophet one-sided? Is this prophet always supporting one political party? Is this prophet always supporting one leader with no criticism whatsoever? If so, they're probably a false prophet. Because we will see that in a second, well, might as well just say it now. We see in Numbers, one of the things that we are told in Numbers is how great of a leader Moses is and how Moses is chosen by God over all of the political rivals to Moses. Moses is chosen. And yet Moses still fails. We see at the end of Numbers, Moses isn't even allowed into the promised land because Moses has failed. And this shows us that no matter how great the political leader is, and no matter how much God has supported that leader, if you can't find areas where that leader has failed God, you have to really question what's going on. Because that's part of what we see again and again in the Hebrew Bible. We see leaders failing. God raises this person up, and this person does really, really great things. And this person is wonderful and leads the people, and then all of a sudden, that person fails. Not to say that they fail and are irredeemable, but they fail. They do not hold up to God's standard. And that is important for us as we think about books like Numbers. Israel, though, even though Balaam has failed to curse Israel, that does not stop Moab. Rather, Moab comes up with a much more sinister plan. The nation of Moab comes up with a much more sinister plan, and that is to use women to seduce Israel into idolatry. Idolatry and prostitution go hand in hand in Old Testament times, the pagan nations around Israel. Temple prostitution was just part of the norm. Cultic sexual activity was part of the norm. And the Bible is very, very clear that proper worship of God does not involve cultic sexual acts. And Moab decides we're going to use that to our advantage. And they send women in to seduce Israel, and there's a big scandal. And another fail by Israel. After all of this, or alongside all of this, we see again just how Israel continues to fail. And I forgot, I should have mentioned, I didn't even talk about this, but we also see the failure of Israel bringing on serpents earlier in the book, and Moses crafting the bronze serpent. This is a really tricky passage, but we do see that, and this is really, really weird, Israel's failure leads directly to plagues. It leads to poor actions, and we see dire consequences for the people of Israel as they continually fail God throughout the book. But we see again and again that God forgives, and God still works with the people, and God still uses the people, and God still tries and pushes the people and gives good leadership to the people if they were willing to listen. This is a story for us where we fail again and again, sometimes because of direct disobedience, sometimes because we just are lazy, sometimes for a myriad of reasons. We fail God. And yet God is forgiving and faithful and stays with us and doesn't forsake us. And God heals. I think that one of the things that is often overlooked in Numbers, and I should have said this a lot earlier as I was going through the book, but one of the things that we see in this book is this action with the serpents. Now, there's a plague of snakes that come into the land, into the people. And this plague is devastating Israel. God talks to Moses and tells Moses, put a bronzed snake up on a pole. Now, we don't think about it, but that word is actually a seraph. You might remember in Isaiah, the seraphim are in front of the throne of God, and one of them touches Isaiah with a live coal to cleanse his mouth. Well, seraphim is just plural for seraph. In other words, what Isaiah sees is a bunch of bronze snakes flying around God's throne. Yeah, I know, it's strange. What we see in Moses is told to use common medicine at his time, which was sympathetic magic, and put a bronze serpent up on a pole so that anybody can use it, can look at it, and be healed. This was common medical practice of the day. We see God working through the medicine and the technology available to the people to bring about cure, to bring about hope. We then see that same bronze serpent brought up again, I think it's in 2 Kings, where it's called Nehushtan, and it has become an idol. And this becomes a warning to us. While God will work through our technology, through our medicine, through our workings, and our ways, there are times when those same instruments no longer serve God but become idols for us. And this is a warning for us as we go later into the biblical text. While it is great for God to use our instruments now, we have to be careful that we don't idolize those same instruments, because they can bring us downfall. And so here we have the story of the wilderness. The wilderness is not simply a geographical location. It is that. It probably reflects some historical data that the people of Israel wandered the wilderness for a significant time. But it is not simply geographical, it's theological. This is the wilderness. This is the dark night of the soul that Israel goes through as they learn to relate to God in new and important ways. This is a metaphor for all of the wilderness that you and I will travel, the wilderness that the church travels, as we grow and connect to God. And so I hope you enjoy the book of Numbers. I hope you learn from it. I hope you don't get overwhelmed by the difficulty in the census numbers and some of the drier material. I hope that you can work through all of that and see the true glory of the book. And I will see you back again for Deuteronomy.